Hello, my friend. Before we begin tonight's journey, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. Some of you may be settling into bed after a long day. Others might be listening while rain taps softly against a window or while a small lamp glows quietly in an otherwise dark room. And if you find these long historical wanderings relaxing, you can always leave a like or subscribe. It helps the channel, of course, but more importantly, it helps these strange little journeys find other curious travelers. Now, there is a peculiar thought that occasionally appears in the mind without invitation. A thought so simple that it almost feels childish. What if the ground beneath your feet is not really the ground at all? What if it is merely the latest layer, the newest page in an impossibly thick book? Because everywhere humans have dug into the earth, they have discovered something unsettling. Another flaw, another road, another wall, another forgotten life. Again and again, the shovel descends, and history appears, sometimes a few inches below, sometimes several meters. Sometimes entire cities emerge from beneath the modern world, as though they had simply been sleeping there. And perhaps that is where our story truly begins. Not with floods, not with empires, not with disasters, but with mud, ordinary mud, the least glamorous substance imaginable. Mud does not arrive with the drama of fire. It does not roar like a volcano. It does not flash across the sky like lightning. Mud simply appears, quietly, patiently, a little at a time. And then one day, people discover that what was once a doorway is now a basement. What was once a street is now underground. What was once the surface has become memory. Imagine waking one morning, 5,000 years ago, in a small settlement near a river. The house is made from earth. The walls are earth. The floor is earth. The road outside is earth. Even many of the dishes drying beside the doorway began their existence as earth. Everything feels permanent when viewed through a single human lifetime. Yet permanence is often nothing more than a temporary agreement between people and weather. The river nearby appears calm. It has appeared calm for weeks, perhaps months. Children run along its banks. Fishermen work quietly in the morning mist. Animals drink from the water. Life organizes itself around the river because rivers are generous, at least most of the time. And then one season, the water rises slightly higher than expected. Not enough to cause panic. Not enough to become a story. Just enough to leave a thin layer of wet sediment behind. A film of mud. A few days later it dries. Life continues. Nobody gives it much thought. Years pass. Another flood arrives. Again, not catastrophic, just inconvenient. The kind of event people complain about while cleaning their sandals. Another layer settles. Then another. Then another. Generation after generation. A little inconvenience becomes geography. A temporary annoyance becomes landscape. Nobody notices because nobody lives long enough to watch the entire process unfold. That may be one of the strangest truths about human beings. We are remarkably skilled at adapting to slow changes, especially when those changes occur slightly too slowly to alarm us. If a mountain appeared overnight in the middle of your town, everyone would panic. If the same mountain appeared one grain of dirt at a time over 3,000 years, it would eventually become a tourist attraction. Humans are peculiar that way. The ancient world was filled with these slow transformations. People repaired damaged floors, raised foundations, added fresh layers of packed earth, covered old roads, rebuilt collapsed walls, filled ditches, leveled rubble, solved immediate problems. Always immediate problems. Almost nobody wakes up thinking about archaeology. People think about wet feet, leaking roofs, hungry children, rotting grain. Ancient people were no different, and that may be one reason modern observers sometimes become fascinated by buried cities. We imagine great mysteries, hidden civilizations, forgotten worlds, secret catastrophes. Meanwhile, the people living there were mostly worried about whether their food storage remained dry. History often feels grand from a distance. Up close, it usually smells slightly unpleasant. Imagine a settlement after heavy flooding. The water finally retreats. At first, there is relief. Then comes the work. Mud everywhere. Mud inside homes. Mud inside storage rooms. Mud coating tools. Mud covering roads. Mud trapped between floorboards. Mud drying on walls. Mud filling wells. Mud beneath fingernails. Mud becoming the defining fact of existence. There is something deeply exhausting about mud. Water can be escaped. Fire can be extinguished. Wind eventually moves on. Mud lingers. It follows people indoors. It hardens where it is unwanted. It softens where strength is needed. It turns walking into labor. It turns labor into frustration. It turns frustration into routine. And then, quite unexpectedly, routine becomes culture. That is another curious feature of human history. Temporary solutions have a tendency to outlive the problems that created them. A village raises its buildings because of flooding. The next generation assumes buildings are simply supposed to be built that way. A town constructs a protective embankment. Centuries later, nobody remembers who built it, only that it exists. An emergency becomes tradition. Tradition becomes identity. Identity becomes permanence, at least until the next flood arrives. And floods always arrive eventually. The river remembers paths humans have forgotten. The water remembers places humans have claimed. The earth remembers everything. That idea appears again and again throughout history. Civilizations rise. Civilizations expand. Civilizations build monuments intended to last forever. Then, weather quietly continues doing what weather has always done. Rain falls. Rivers wander. Sediment accumulates. Mud settles. And beneath each generation, another layer begins forming. Perhaps that is why buried cities feel so haunting. Not because they are mysterious, but because they are familiar. They remind us that every modern street may someday become an archaeological site. Every apartment building, every parking lot, every office tower, every carefully landscaped neighborhood. One day, all of it may lie beneath layers of soil, sediment, rubble, roots, and silence. And so the layers continued accumulating. One flood, one repair, one rebuilding, one generation, then another, until eventually entire worlds disappeared beneath the earth. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, patiently, almost politely, the way mud has always worked. And perhaps that is the most unsettling thought of all. Not that civilizations vanished. Civilizations have always vanished. Not that cities were buried. Cities have always been buried. But that somewhere beneath countless modern streets, beneath apartment buildings and parking lots and carefully maintained parks, lie the remains of ordinary people who once believed their world would last forever. They worried about tomorrow's weather, tomorrow's harvest, tomorrow's bills, tomorrow's children, never imagining that thousands of years later, strangers would stand above their forgotten homes and wonder what catastrophe had erased them. The strange truth is that most worlds do not end in a single day. They sink slowly into memory. A little mud, a little silence, a little forgetting, and eventually the earth closes over them as though they had never been there at all. If you were standing in southern Mesopotamia several thousand years ago, you might initially wonder why anyone chose to live there at all. The landscape could appear strangely unfinished. Not empty exactly, not barren, just uncertain. The horizon stretched outward in long, flat lines, interrupted by reeds, distant water, patches of cultivated land, and settlements that seemed to rise from the earth itself. There were no dramatic mountain ranges watching over the people below. No protective forests wrapping villages in green shelter. No comforting stone landscapes that appeared solid and permanent. Instead, there was water. Water moving where it pleased. Water changing shape with the seasons. Water deciding, often without explanation, whether life would be comfortable or difficult. Yet despite all this uncertainty, people kept arriving. Generations arrived. Families arrived. Entire civilizations emerged from these muddy river valleys. And, in a way, their decision made perfect sense. Because rivers are generous, a river brings fish. A river brings fertile soil. A river brings transportation. A river brings trade. A river brings life. The problem is that rivers never sign agreements. They make no promises. They offer gifts while quietly retaining the right to take everything back. Perhaps that was one of the first lessons learned by the people who built their lives between the great rivers. The river that feeds you is not your friend. It is simply a force that has temporarily decided not to destroy you. For many years, life might feel almost predictable. Fields would produce grain, animals would thrive, children would grow, houses would expand, storage rooms would fill. The future would seem stable enough to make plans. And humans love making plans. We always have, even in uncertain places. Especially in uncertain places. There is something comforting about imagining tomorrow. People planned marriages, planned harvests, planned buildings, planned festivals, planned futures that stretched decades ahead. And then occasionally the river would remind everyone who truly controlled the landscape, not with rage, not with drama, often with remarkable indifference. The water would rise, only slightly at first, perhaps unnoticed, perhaps dismissed, a little higher than last year, a little farther than expected, a little more persistent. Then, one morning, someone would discover that the familiar path was underwater. Another person would notice water pooling near a storage building. Children would be told not to wander near certain areas. Animals would be moved. People would begin watching the river carefully. Anxiety has a peculiar rhythm. It rarely arrives all at once. Instead, it accumulates. A small concern becomes a larger concern. A larger concern becomes a conversation. A conversation becomes a shared unease. And eventually, an entire settlement finds itself listening for sounds that were previously ignored. The ancient world was full of listening. Listening to weather. Listening to animals. Listening to wind. Listening to distant water. Modern people often underestimate how much information once arrived through sound. At night, this became even more important. Imagine lying awake in a mud brick house. The air is warm, the room is dark, the day's work is finished, children are sleeping nearby. Outside, somewhere beyond the village, the river continues moving through darkness. You cannot see it, you can only hear it, a distant presence, a low voice, a reminder, and perhaps tonight it sounds different, perhaps slightly louder, perhaps slightly closer, perhaps nothing is actually wrong. But uncertainty has already entered the room, and once uncertainty arrives, sleep becomes more difficult. This may explain why flood stories became so powerful, not because floods happened every day, but because they might happen. Humans are often more frightened by possibilities than realities. A danger currently occurring can be confronted. A danger that might occur can occupy the imagination indefinitely. The people of Mesopotamia understood this intimately. Every season carried questions. Would the water arrive too early? Would it arrive too late? Would there be enough? Would there be too much? Would the fields survive? Would the grain survive? Would the walls survive? Nobody knew, and so life developed around preparation, not certainty. Preparation, that distinction matters. Civilization itself may be partly defined by preparations for disasters that have not yet happened. A family stores grain because hunger might come. A city builds walls because enemies might arrive. A ruler gathers resources because future problems are inevitable. The future is always threatening something. The river simply made that reality impossible to ignore. What makes these ancient communities fascinating is that they did not merely endure uncertainty. They organized themselves around it. Canals appeared, levees appeared, drainage systems appeared, storage systems appeared, labor systems appeared. Entire social structures emerged from the simple realization that water could not be trusted. At first, these solutions were temporary. Everything begins as temporary. A ditch is dug because of one difficult season. A barrier is raised because of one flood. A storage room is enlarged because of 1 year of abundance. Nobody intends to create tradition. Tradition is often just an old emergency that nobody remembers how to stop performing. That may sound slightly absurd, but history is filled with examples. A practical solution survives, the original problem fades, the solution remains. Generations later, people assume it has always existed. The river valleys became crowded with such inherited habits, each one carrying a forgotten story, each one born from discomfort, each one preserving a memory nobody could fully explain anymore. Sometimes the memory survived only as a myth, and myths are curious things. Modern people often treat myths as false stories. Ancient people often treated myths as emotional truths. There is a difference, a very important difference. A myth does not necessarily preserve fact. A myth preserves feelings, fear, relief, loss, confusion, survival. The exact details may disappear. The emotions remain. Imagine a devastating flood occurring once every few generations. Not every year, not often enough to become routine, just often enough to leave scars. Children hear stories from grandparents. Grandparents heard stories from their grandparents. Details change, names change, locations change. But one thing remains constant. The water rose, people ran, the world disappeared. Some survived, many did not. That emotional memory can travel remarkably far through time, farther than names, farther than dates, farther than facts. Eventually, entire cultures begin telling versions of the same story, a world overwhelmed by water, a warning ignored, a catastrophe approaching, a handful of survivors, a beginning after an ending. And perhaps that is where the idea of an ancient reset first begins to take shape, not as a conspiracy, not as hidden history, but as a deeply human attempt to explain recurring experiences. Because from the perspective of a survivor, every catastrophe feels universal. If your village vanishes, it does not matter whether other villages survive beyond the horizon. Your world ended. The distinction is academic. History is often written by survivors. Memory is often shaped by trauma. And trauma has a tendency to enlarge itself, not dishonestly, not intentionally, simply because pain occupies space. A flood that destroys one community can eventually become a story about the destruction of all communities. A local disaster can slowly transform into a cosmic one. The emotional truth survives even when the geography expands. This process happened again and again throughout human history, not only in Mesopotamia, everywhere. Wherever people lived near rivers, near coasts, near volcanoes, near unstable landscapes, the earth occasionally reminded them that permanence was an illusion, and each reminder left traces. Some traces became mud layers, some traces became ruins, some traces became stories. The stories survived especially well. Stories travel more easily than stones. They weigh less. They require no roads, no carts, no ships, only memory. And memory, for all its flaws, can carry fear across thousands of years. Perhaps that is why so many ancient flood stories feel strangely familiar. They are not describing water. Not really. They are describing vulnerability. They are describing the realization that everything appearing stable today may become unstable tomorrow. The houses, the fields, the roads, the governments, the traditions, the assumptions, even the ground itself, especially the ground itself. Because while people were telling stories about floods, another process continued quietly beneath their feet. The mud remained. Each flood left a little behind. Each rebuilding added another layer. Each collapsed wall became future soil. Each abandoned structure slowly merged with the landscape. The city grew taller without moving. The earth grew deeper without anyone noticing. And centuries later, when future generations walked across those same places, they often had no idea they were standing above entire forgotten worlds. Worlds that once felt just as permanent as their own. There is a curious moment that appears in nearly every civilization. A moment when people stop asking how to survive nature and begin asking why nature has turned against them. The difference may seem small, but it changes everything. As long as a flood is simply water, the solution appears practical. Raise a wall, dig a canal, move supplies, repair a roof, store more grain. But once a flood becomes a question, once people begin asking why, the disaster enters a different realm entirely. It becomes something larger than water, larger than weather, larger than rivers. It becomes a story, and stories have a tendency to outlive the events that created them. Imagine a settlement somewhere in the ancient world, not necessarily a famous city, not necessarily a place that would ever appear in a history book, just a community, a few hundred people perhaps, families who know one another, children who recognize every face, farmers who walk the same paths each morning, people whose entire understanding of the world extends only a few days beyond the horizon. Then something happens. Perhaps a flood arrives during the night. Perhaps the river behaves in a way nobody remembers. Perhaps multiple seasons of unusual weather combine into something far worse than expected. Whatever the cause, the result feels impossible. Homes disappear. Fields vanish. Livestock are carried away. Landmarks cease to exist. Paths become rivers. Rivers become lakes. The familiar world dissolves. And afterward, survivors gather together and attempt to explain what has happened. This is where things become fascinating. Because human beings rarely tolerate randomness for very long. We are meaning-making creatures. If something terrible occurs, we want a reason. Not necessarily a correct reason, just a reason. A story large enough to contain the pain. Ancient people were no different. In some ways, they may have been even more determined to find explanations than we are. The world around them felt alive. The rivers possessed personalities. The storms possessed intentions. The earth itself appeared capable of moods. When disaster arrived, many people naturally concluded that something had gone wrong within the relationship between humans and the forces surrounding them. Perhaps rituals had been neglected. Perhaps promises had been broken. Perhaps someone had angered the gods. Perhaps the world itself had become unbalanced. To modern ears, these explanations may sound strange. Yet if we are honest, we still behave similarly. We simply use different language. When something unexpected happens today, people search for causes, governments, markets, technology, politics, social change. We construct narratives. Ancient people did the same thing. Only their narratives involved divine beings rather than economic indicators. The human impulse remains remarkably similar, and so stories began spreading. Stories of enormous floods, stories of destruction, stories of warnings, stories of survival. stories of worlds ending and beginning again. The details varied from place to place. Yet certain patterns appeared repeatedly. A catastrophe approaches. Most people ignore the danger. A small number survive. The old world disappears. A new world emerges. Again and again the same structure appears, like an echo moving across centuries. What makes these stories so intriguing is not their similarity, it is their emotional consistency. The emotional landscape rarely changes. Fear, loss, confusion, relief, survival. Those feelings remain recognizable even thousands of years later. And perhaps that is because they belong to something fundamentally human. Imagine standing among survivors after a flood. The water has finally receded. The sky is clear again. Birds have returned. Sunlight reflects from pools left behind across the landscape. At first glance, everything seems peaceful. Yet peace can be deceptive. The disaster may be over. Its consequences are only beginning. This is the stage that ancient stories often leave out. The uncomfortable weeks afterward, the mud, the smell, the exhaustion, the uncertainty. A flood rarely ends when the water leaves. In many ways, that is when the real work begins. The ground remains saturated. Storage buildings must be inspected. Wells may be contaminated. Food supplies require examination. Animals must be located. Shelter must be repaired. The dead must be mourned. Life continues demanding attention, even when grief feels overwhelming. Perhaps that is one reason flood myths became so powerful. They offered structure. A disaster without meaning is difficult to carry. A disaster transformed into a story becomes slightly easier to bear. Not because the pain disappears, because the pain acquires shape. Humans have always preferred shaped suffering to shapeless suffering. A story allows people to place themselves somewhere inside the chaos. It tells them where the beginning was. It tells them where the ending was. Reality rarely provides such clarity. Reality tends to blur. Days merge together. Memories overlap. Details fade. Yet the story remains, generation after generation. A grandfather describes the flood. His grandchildren repeat the tale. Their grandchildren alter it slightly. A local event slowly becomes something larger. A severe flood becomes the flood. A destroyed community becomes the world. The transformation is gradual, almost invisible. Nobody decides to create a myth. The myth grows naturally, the way roots grow beneath soil, the way rivers slowly alter landscapes, the way mud accumulates one thin layer at a time. And perhaps that is why so many ancient stories describe the destruction of entire worlds. Not because every storyteller witnessed a global catastrophe, but because every survivor experienced the end of a world, their world. The distinction matters. Imagine losing every familiar landmark, every routine, every certainty, every expectation about tomorrow. From an emotional perspective, that feels remarkably close to the end of everything. The language becomes understandable. The scale becomes understandable. The myth begins making sense. And meanwhile, the earth continues its patient work. Long after the storytellers are gone, long after the survivors disappear, long after their descendants inherit new concerns, the physical evidence remains, layer after layer, flood deposits, collapsed walls, abandoned roads, buried foundations. Archaeologists often describe these layers in technical language: sediment, strata, occupation levels, construction phases, useful terms, accurate terms. Yet beneath those words lie human experiences. A layer of mud is not merely geology, it is interruption, it is inconvenience, it is panic, it is labour, it is adaptation, it is survival. Every buried layer once existed at the center of someone's life. Someone worried there. Someone laughed there. Someone planned a future there. Someone assumed tomorrow would resemble today. Then something changed. And centuries later, all that remains is a line in the earth, a different color of soil, a subtle boundary separating one world from another. Perhaps that is what people find so haunting about buried cities. Not the mystery, not the archaeology, the familiarity, the realization that every modern city is currently producing future layers. Future archaeologists may someday examine our remains with the same detached curiosity. A parking garage might become an excavation site. A shopping centre might become a historical puzzle. A collapsed apartment building might become a buried structure whose original purpose requires interpretation. The thought is strangely humbling. People often imagine history as something behind them. In reality, history is accumulating beneath them every day. Every demolished building, every repaired road, every abandoned foundation, every forgotten object, everything slowly entering the earth, everything waiting. And while all of this was happening in ancient river valleys, another subtle transformation was occurring inside the human imagination. The floods were becoming older. The stories were becoming larger. The survivors were becoming ancestors. Memory was becoming myth. And myth was beginning to stretch beyond ordinary human experience. Because once enough generations pass, a flood is no longer merely a flood. It becomes a warning, a lesson, a symbol, a reminder that the world is less stable than it appears, a reminder that certainty can vanish, a reminder that civilizations themselves may be temporary arrangements between human ambition and geological patience. The earth does not rush. The earth does not argue. The earth simply waits, and eventually, given enough time, nearly everything sinks into its embrace. A house, a road, a city, a kingdom, even a story. Those stories, to their credit, usually resist a little longer. The longer human beings live in one place, the more they begin to believe that the place belongs to them. It is an understandable mistake. A child is born. The child grows into an adult. The adult grows old. The fields remain. The river remains. The houses remain. Everything appears permanent because everything has existed for the entire duration of a single life. And a single life feels very long from the inside, long enough to forget that the earth measures time differently, long enough to imagine that stability is normal, long enough to assume tomorrow will resemble yesterday. Perhaps that is why ancient catastrophe stories feel so unsettling. They challenge one of humanity's favorite assumptions. The assumption that the world we know is the world that will continue. The people of the ancient Near East were surrounded by evidence suggesting otherwise. Every flood left reminders. Every drought left reminders. Every failed harvest left reminders. Yet even then, people continued building, continued planning, continued believing. Human optimism is remarkably difficult to destroy. It survives evidence that would discourage almost any other creature. A farmer whose fields flood may replant. A merchant whose warehouse collapses may rebuild. A city damaged repeatedly may expand rather than retreat. Again and again, people choose hope, sometimes wisely, sometimes foolishly, usually both at the same time. And somewhere within this cycle of destruction and rebuilding, certain stories began taking shape. Stories unlike ordinary tales. Stories carrying the weight of memory. Stories attempting to explain not merely what happened, but why it happened. Imagine sitting beside a fire thousands of years ago. The day has ended. Work is finished. Darkness surrounds the settlement. Children listen. Adults listen. The storyteller begins. Not with a king, not with a battle, not with treasure, but with a warning about a time when the world itself became unacceptable, a time when something had gone wrong, not merely in one village, not merely in one kingdom, everywhere. The details varied depending upon who told the story. Yet a remarkable theme appeared again and again. Humanity had somehow crossed a boundary. Perhaps people had become too loud. Perhaps they had become too corrupt. Perhaps they had forgotten sacred obligations. Perhaps they had simply multiplied beyond what the gods desired. The explanation changed. The outcome remained familiar. A great destruction approached. And here the stories become especially interesting. Because the catastrophe is rarely portrayed as chaotic, it is deliberate, intentional, chosen. The flood does not simply happen. Someone decides it should happen. This transforms the disaster from weather into judgment. And judgment is easier for human beings to understand than randomness. Randomness offers no lesson. Judgment offers a lesson. Even if the lesson is terrifying, there is something deeply unsettling about this idea. The suggestion that destruction might be purposeful, the suggestion that suffering might be planned, the suggestion that the world itself occasionally reaches a point where someone or something decides it must be reset. Modern audiences often focus on the flood itself. Ancient audiences may have focused more on the decision. Why was the destruction necessary? Why had the old world become unacceptable? Why begin again? These questions lingered. And perhaps they continue lingering because they touch something fundamental within human psychology. People repeatedly imagine fresh start, new beginnings, clean slates, resets. Individuals imagine them. Families imagine them. Nations imagine them. Entire civilizations imagine them. Sometimes the fantasy is hopeful. Sometimes it is frightening. Often it is both. Consider how frequently people talk about starting over. A new year, a new home, a new city, a new career, a new chapter. Human beings seem permanently fascinated by the possibility of beginning again. Yet every beginning requires an ending. That is the uncomfortable part. Ancient flood stories understood this perfectly. The old world disappears. Only then can the new world emerge. The logic is brutal, but emotionally compelling, especially for people living within landscapes where destruction and renewal constantly appeared together. Floodwater destroys. Floodwater nourishes. Volcanoes bury. Volcanoes enrich soil. Rivers erase boundaries. Rivers create fertile land. Nature often behaves this way, cruel and generous simultaneously. Perhaps ancient people simply noticed the pattern. Perhaps the myths emerged from observing that endings and beginnings frequently arrive together. A flood leaves devastation behind. It also leaves fresh soil. A storm destroys homes. It may also refill reservoirs. A disaster closes one future while opening another. None of this makes suffering pleasant. It merely makes it complicated. And complicated truths tend to survive longer than simple ones. The stories certainly survived. Long after the original events faded, long after the names of specific survivors disappeared, long after cities rose and fell, the image remained. Water covering the world. A handful of survivors. The promise of a second beginning. The image became part of humanity's collective imagination. And perhaps the reason is simpler than it first appears. Because nearly everyone has experienced some version of it. Not literally. Emotionally, a relationship ends. A life changes. A familiar world collapses. For a brief period, everything feels submerged. Then, eventually, the waters recede. The landscape looks different. You look different. The world continues. Ancient stories often operate on this emotional level. Their power comes not from historical precision. Their power comes from recognition. People hear the story and think, Yes, I know what it feels like to lose a world. Perhaps that is why these myths travelled so far. Not because everyone experienced the same flood, because everyone experienced loss. Loss translates easily between cultures. Fear translates easily. Hope translates easily. The combination of all three creates stories that can survive thousands of years. Meanwhile, outside the stories themselves, the actual Earth continued accumulating evidence. Flood layers, mud deposits, buried walls, abandoned settlements, generation after generation, unknowingly building atop older generations. A city burns, the ruins are leveled, new structures appear, a flood arrives, sediment accumulates, another city rises, centuries pass, the ground itself grows thicker with history, one world resting directly above another, like dreams stacked upon dreams. This process occurred so gradually that nobody noticed it happening. People rarely notice slow transformations, especially when they are busy living. A child born in one generation sees the world as normal. That child's grandchild sees a slightly different world and also considers it normal. The changes accumulate invisibly. Then, eventually, someone digs, and suddenly the past appears. A forgotten wall, a buried street, a staircase descending nowhere, a doorway leading underground. Discoveries like these have always fascinated people because they create a peculiar sensation, a feeling that time is not truly gone, only hidden, waiting, sleeping. The earth becomes less like a grave and more like an archive. A messy archive, an archive organized by floods, storms, collapses, accidents, and centuries of neglect. Not the most efficient filing system, but remarkably durable. The deeper archaeologists dig, the stranger this archive often becomes. Entire neighborhoods, workshops, temples, storage rooms, roads, lives, all preserved to varying degrees beneath later history, not because anyone intended preservation, because forgetting itself can be protective. The earth covers, the earth seals, the earth hides, and hidden things sometimes survive. There is a certain irony there. Many of the structures most carefully protected by their builders have vanished completely. Others survived precisely because they were buried and forgotten. Oblivion occasionally functions as a form of shelter. A strange thought. But history is full of strange thoughts. Perhaps that is why the idea of ancient resets remains so captivating. Not because evidence points toward one enormous forgotten catastrophe, but because history repeatedly presents smaller versions of the same pattern: collapse, burial, silence, rediscovery. Again and again, civilizations do not disappear once. They disappear continually, sometimes dramatically, more often quietly. A road abandoned, a harbour filled with silt, a village covered by sand, a city rebuilt after fire, a neighbourhood swallowed by mud. Each event small compared to the scale of the planet, enormous compared to the people experiencing it. And perhaps somewhere deep within the human imagination, all these countless endings slowly merge together. Thousands of local disasters, thousands of buried places, thousands of lost worlds, combining into a single haunting question. What if this has happened before? Not once, not twice, but over and over again. What if every civilization believes itself permanent just before discovering it is temporary? What if every generation imagines itself modern while standing atop forgotten generations who once believed exactly the same thing? And what if, beneath the stories of angry gods and great floods, there remains a quieter truth? A truth less dramatic, yet somehow more unsettling, that the earth does not need to destroy the world all at once. It only needs patience. And the earth has never lacked patience. At some point, almost every ancient city begins keeping secrets. Not intentionally, Cities are not trying to deceive anyone. They simply grow older. And age has a habit of hiding things. A child loses a toy beneath a floor. A merchant drops a coin into a crack between stones. A wall collapses and is replaced. A doorway is sealed. A courtyard is rebuilt. A house becomes a ruin. The ruin becomes a foundation. The foundation disappears beneath something newer, and before anyone realizes it, an entire world has slipped out of sight. Not vanished, merely hidden. There is an important difference. Vanishing suggests absence. Hidden things remain present, waiting quietly, waiting beneath layers of dust and soil and forgotten years. If you could somehow stand above an ancient city and watch several thousand years pass in only a few moments, the process would appear surprisingly gentle. No dramatic music, no thunder, no great final speech, just endless small changes. Rain falling, walls cracking, people repairing, people rebuilding, people abandoning, people returning, one layer settling atop another, history accumulating like blankets placed one over the next. Eventually the city would begin sinking beneath its own memories. Not physically, perhaps, but visually. The older world would slowly disappear beneath the newer one, and nobody living there would notice. Because human beings are wonderfully adapted to gradual change, we rarely notice transformations occurring at the speed of generations. Imagine walking through a city where your great-grandparents once lived. Many things would seem familiar, some things would seem new. You would likely consider the place fundamentally the same. Now imagine repeating that process for 50 generations, 100 generations, 200 generations. The city eventually becomes unrecognizable. Yet every individual living there experiences only a small portion of the transformation. Nobody witnesses the entire journey. That may be why archaeology feels so strange. Archaeology allows people to see time compressed. A shovel removes what centuries created. A trench reveals changes that no single human ever observed unfolding, and suddenly a buried wall emerges from the earth. A staircase, a room, a street. Evidence that another version of reality once existed directly beneath the present one. The feeling can be surprisingly unsettling, even for experienced archaeologists, because buried cities challenge one of our deepest assumptions. We assume the ground is the beginning. The ground feels final, solid, reliable, foundational, yet excavation reveals something different. The ground is often only the latest chapter. Beneath it lies another surface, and beneath that surface another, and beneath that another. Entire histories stacked vertically, lives resting atop older lives, civilizations resting atop older civilizations. The effect can feel almost dreamlike, as though reality itself possesses layers. In some ancient settlements, archaeologists have uncovered evidence showing that people repeatedly rebuilt in exactly the same location for centuries, sometimes thousands of years. At first, this seems irrational. Why remain in a place repeatedly damaged by floods? Why rebuild where destruction already occurred? Why not simply leave? The answer is both practical and deeply human, because people rarely abandon places that contain their lives. A fertile floodplain remains fertile after a flood. A trade route remains valuable after a disaster. A homeland remains a homeland even when it becomes dangerous. Memory has gravity. People stay because their parents stayed. Their grandparents stayed. Their ancestors are buried there. Their stories belong there. The place becomes part of their identity. Leaving means abandoning more than buildings. It means abandoning continuity. Humans are often willing to endure remarkable risks in exchange for continuity. You can see this pattern throughout history. A city floods. People rebuild. A volcano erupts. People return. A war destroys neighborhoods. Families reconstruct them, again and again, not because the danger disappears, because attachment outweighs danger. There is something both admirable and slightly absurd about this. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to look directly at a problem and say, yes, but this is where I keep my things. History contains countless examples of this philosophy, and somehow civilization exists largely because of it. One of the strangest consequences of rebuilding is that the city gradually rises, not all at once, slowly, imperceptibly. A damaged building collapses. Its rubble remains. New construction occurs atop the rubble. Flood sediment arrives. Another layer forms. Roads are resurfaced. Foundations are elevated. Generation after generation, the ground level inches upward. Nobody notices. Why would they? The change occurs too slowly. A few inches here, a few inches there. A lifetime passes. Another lifetime passes. The city climbs while appearing stationary. Then, centuries later, someone excavates beneath a modern street and discovers another street below it. Then another, and perhaps another still. The realization is difficult to ignore. Entire worlds have been buried, not by one enormous catastrophe, but by the accumulation of ordinary life. In some ways, this is more unsettling than a sudden disaster. Catastrophes are dramatic. Accumulation is relentless. A catastrophe ends. Accumulation never does. Even now, at this very moment, cities around the world are producing future archaeological layers. Buildings are being demolished. Roads are being repaired. Structures are being abandoned. Objects are being lost. Everything is contributing to future history, future mysteries, future excavations, future confusion. One day, people may stand above the remains of our own civilization and misunderstand us entirely. In fairness, we have misunderstood plenty of people ourselves. Perhaps misunderstanding is one of humanity's oldest traditions. Imagine an archaeologist, thousands of years from now, uncovering fragments of modern life. A parking meter, a shopping cart, a smartphone, a fragment of plumbing. Without context, some of these objects might appear deeply mysterious. Others might seem ridiculous. Many would likely be both. The same thing happens whenever we examine ancient remains. We see only fragments. The ordinary details are often missing. And yet, it is the ordinary details that mattered most to the people living there. The ancient homeowner did not wake up thinking about future archaeology. They worried about leaking roofs, broken tools, family disputes, weather, food, money, the same concerns that occupy people today. History often feels distant because we encounter it through ruins. Ruins create an illusion of difference. They make ancient people appear exotic, mysterious, fundamentally unlike us. Then archaeology uncovers a forgotten kitchen, or a child's toy, or a half-finished meal, and suddenly the distance collapses. The people become recognizable again, not historical figures, just people. That may be the most powerful aspect of buried cities. They preserve evidence of ordinary existence, not merely kings, not merely wars, not merely monuments, but routines, habits, mistakes, small moments, the texture of everyday life, a forgotten storage jar, a repaired wall, a worn pathway, a threshold polished smooth by generations of footsteps. These details survive because they were never intended to survive. They were too ordinary to protect, too ordinary to celebrate, too ordinary to record, and yet they often reveal more about the past than any monument ever could. The longer one studies buried cities, the more a strange pattern begins to emerge. The earth is not merely preserving disasters, it is preserving interruptions, moments when life stopped unexpectedly, moments when routines ended, moments when tomorrow failed to arrive as expected. A family went to sleep, believing the future would resemble the past. Then something changed. A flood, a fire, an earthquake, a collapse, an abandonment. And centuries later we find traces of that interruption frozen beneath the soil. A door left closed, a vessel left where it stood, a room left unfinished. The evidence feels intimate, almost intrusive, like reading a letter never intended for your eyes. Perhaps that is why buried cities evoke such powerful emotions. They remind us that every civilization consists mostly of ordinary days, not dramatic events, ordinary days, breakfasts, conversations, repairs, arguments, plans. The future always appears available right up until the moment it isn't. The people living in those buried houses rarely knew they were experiencing their final normal day. Nobody ever does. History reveals this lesson repeatedly. The final ordinary day is invisible while it is happening. Only afterward does it become remarkable. Only afterward does it acquire meaning. And then centuries pass. The city disappears. Grass grows. Soil accumulates. Trees arrive. Empires rise and fall above the forgotten ruins. Eventually, even the memory fades. The location becomes ordinary once more. A field, a hill, a patch of land, nothing special, at least on the surface. Beneath the surface, however, another world waits patiently. A world that once felt permanent. A world whose inhabitants likely believed they understood the future. A world buried not because it was unimportant, but because time eventually buries almost everything. And the most remarkable part is this. Many of those buried people probably imagined that history was happening somewhere else, to someone else, in another city, in another kingdom, under another sky, just as many people imagine today. Meanwhile, beneath their feet, the next layer was already beginning to form. There is something uniquely unsettling about an abandoned city, but there is something even stranger than abandonment. A city that appears to have been interrupted, not destroyed in the dramatic way we often imagine, not erased completely, not reduced to legend, simply interrupted, as though life paused in the middle of a sentence and never resumed. Human beings are accustomed to endings, even sad endings. A book ends, a conversation ends, a journey ends, a life ends. Endings feel natural. What feels unnatural is incompletion, a task left unfinished, a door left open, a meal left uneaten, a room left exactly as it was. These things disturb us because they suggest an absence where presence should be, a question where an answer should exist, and buried cities are often filled with such questions. Imagine walking through a place where nobody has lived for centuries. At first, you expect emptiness. You expect silence. You expect distance. Then you notice something peculiar. The silence does not feel empty. It feels interrupted. A storage jar still stands where someone placed it. A cooking area remains recognizable. A pathway continues leading somewhere. A wall still separates one room from another. The arrangement of life remains visible. The people are gone. The pattern remains. And suddenly, the past feels uncomfortably close, much closer than expected. Because ruins are one thing. Ruins belong to history. Interrupted lives belong to people. There is a difference, a very important difference. Human beings relate to people far more easily than they relate to history. A broken temple can feel impressive. A forgotten kitchen can feel heartbreaking. The kitchen reminds us that somebody expected to come back. Somebody assumed tomorrow would arrive normally. Somebody had plans. Perhaps that is why certain archaeological discoveries affect people so deeply. not because they reveal ancient greatness, because they reveal ancient normality, and normality is fragile, far more fragile than monuments. Consider how little it takes to disrupt an ordinary day: a sudden illness, an unexpected storm, a distant piece of news, a missed train, a phone call. The structure of daily life depends upon countless assumptions functioning correctly. Most of the time they do, which is why normal life feels permanent. Yet permanence is often nothing more than a successful streak of uninterrupted days. Ancient cities lived under the same illusion. A baker prepared bread, believing customers would arrive tomorrow. A merchant organized goods, believing trade would continue. Parents planned futures for children. Children imagined futures for themselves. Ordinary expectations filled every street. Then something happened, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly, but often enough that the earth remembers. One of the strangest truths in archaeology is that preservation frequently requires disaster. Without disaster, things disappear. Wood rots, fabric decays, food vanishes, buildings collapse gradually. The details of everyday life dissolve. Catastrophe occasionally interrupts that process. A layer of ash, a blanket of mud, a sudden burial, an unexpected covering. The destruction becomes preservation, a paradox that appears repeatedly throughout history. The very event that ended one world protected it from the centuries that followed. If that sounds slightly cruel, it is. History is full of cruel ironies. Imagine a settlement going about its ordinary business. Children playing, food cooking, repairs being made, conversations taking place. The future appearing entirely reasonable. Nobody knows they are living inside what future generations will call an archaeological site. That phrase alone would probably seem absurd to them. An archaeological site. What a strange way to describe somebody's home. Yet that transformation eventually occurs. A living place becomes a historical place. A familiar street becomes an excavation trench. A household becomes evidence. The process is strangely impersonal. History has a habit of converting lives into information. But if we slow down enough, we can still glimpse the people hidden beneath the information. A repaired crack in a wall, a patch on a floor, a doorway widened slightly over time. Evidence of ordinary problem solving, evidence that people adapted, because adaptation may be humanity's most common activity. Ancient people spent enormous portions of their lives adapting to circumstances. Weather changed, they adapted. Rivers shifted, they adapted. Resources became scarce, they adapted. Floods arrived, they adapted. Humans are remarkably resilient creatures, perhaps too resilient sometimes. We become accustomed to difficulties so thoroughly that we begin treating them as normal. A village experiences frequent flooding. The next generation considers flooding ordinary. A city repeatedly rebuilds damaged neighborhoods. The next generation assumes rebuilding is simply part of life. The unusual becomes familiar. The familiar becomes tradition. Tradition becomes identity, and eventually people forget there was ever another way. This process occurred countless times across the ancient world. One generation solved a problem. The solution survived. The original problem faded from memory. Centuries later, people continued following customs whose origins nobody fully understood. There is something oddly comforting about that, and something slightly amusing. Human civilization contains an astonishing number of inherited habits that began as temporary improvisations. One can almost imagine ancient ancestors looking down in confusion. You are still doing that? We only built it because the river flooded. We only raised the floor because the walls kept getting wet. We only moved the doorway because water kept entering from the east. Yet these practical decisions accumulated. Over time, they reshaped entire cities, entire cultures. entire ways of life. Meanwhile, the earth continued recording everything, patiently, without judgment, without urgency. The earth is perhaps history's most diligent archivist, not because it intends to preserve information, because it forgets very slowly. Human memory is fragile. Stories change. Records disappear. Languages vanish. The earth simply keeps layers, one atop another. A remarkably effective system. Messy, complicated, occasionally confusing, but effective. And sometimes those layers produce moments that feel almost supernatural. An archaeologist removes soil. A wall appears. More soil disappears. A room emerges. More excavation. An entire building reveals itself. Suddenly, a space hidden for centuries sees sunlight again. The moment must feel extraordinary. A place effectively asleep for generations awakening briefly. Not alive, yet not entirely dead either. Something in between. The objects remain exactly where people left them. The layout remains understandable. The logic remains visible. Only the people themselves are absent. And absence can be surprisingly powerful, often more powerful than presence. A crowded room tells one story. An empty room tells many. The imagination rushes to fill the silence. Who lived here? What happened? Why did they leave? Did they know they were leaving? Did they expect to return? Questions accumulate quickly. Answers arrive more slowly. Sometimes they never arrive at all. Perhaps that uncertainty explains why buried cities continue captivating people. Not merely scholars, everyone. There is something universally fascinating about interrupted lives. Because interruption is one of humanity's deepest fears. Not death necessarily, interruption, the feeling that plans might remain unfinished, that conversations might stop mid-sentence, that futures might dissolve unexpectedly. Ancient cities preserve evidence of exactly that fear, not in theory, in physical form, a threshold worn smooth by footsteps that no longer come, a room waiting for occupants who never returned, a path leading toward destinations forgotten by history. The details linger, the people do not, yet somehow the details continue speaking, quietly, patiently, across centuries. And the more we listen, the more a strange realization begins emerging. The ancient world was not destroyed once. It was interrupted repeatedly. Small interruptions, large interruptions, local interruptions, regional interruptions, again and again. Some lasted months, some lasted generations, some became permanent, and every interruption left traces. Traces buried beneath later lives, later cities, later assumptions, until eventually entire landscapes became layered with forgotten beginnings and unfinished endings. Perhaps that is why so many people experience a peculiar feeling when looking at buried ruins. Not sadness exactly, not nostalgia, something harder to describe. A sense that the distance between past and present is thinner than expected. That ordinary life is more fragile than it appears. That today's routines may someday become tomorrow's mysteries. And that somewhere beneath the places we consider permanent, countless other people once believed exactly the same thing. Most people rarely think about the ground. It is simply there, reliable, unremarkable, a surface beneath our feet. A place to walk, a place to build, a place to stand, while worrying about entirely different things. The ground feels finished, complete, certain, and perhaps that is why discoveries beneath the ground feel so unsettling. They challenge something we normally take for granted, the assumption that there is a bottom, the assumption that eventually we reach the original surface, the real surface, the first surface. Yet history has a habit of complicating simple assumptions, especially assumptions involving permanence. Imagine walking through an ancient city during its busiest years. People move through narrow streets. Merchants negotiate. Children run through alleys. Animals wander where they should not. Workers repair damaged walls. Life unfolds with all the beautiful disorder that life usually contains. Now imagine freezing that moment, not stopping time, simply preserving it. Then imagine adding a thin layer of mud across everything. Not much, just enough to notice. A few inches, perhaps. Life continues. People clean. People repair. People adapt. The city survives. Years pass. Another layer arrives, perhaps from flooding, perhaps from rebuilding, perhaps from erosion, perhaps from simple neglect. Again, life continues. Nobody sees a catastrophe. Nobody predicts archaeology. Nobody imagines future excavations. The process feels ordinary because it is ordinary. That may be one of the most important ideas in this entire story. Burial often begins as inconvenience, not disaster. A little mud, a little debris, a little reconstruction. The accumulation appears harmless, even practical. A damaged street receives new material. A collapsed structure is leveled. A flooded area is raised. People solve immediate problems. The future consequences remain invisible. Humans specialize in solving immediate problems. Civilization itself might be described as a collection of immediate solutions that survived far longer than expected. An overflowing river becomes a canal. A temporary barrier becomes a wall. A raised platform becomes a district. A repair becomes architecture. A response becomes tradition, and all the while the city slowly rises. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone to notice. A child grows up believing the current street level has always existed. Why wouldn't they? It existed for their entire life. The same assumption passes to the next generation, and the next, and the next. Then, centuries later, someone digs beneath that street. Another street appears, older, buried, forgotten. The effect can feel almost impossible, like discovering a memory beneath a memory, or a dream beneath another dream. Because what we call a city is often less like a single place and more like a stack of places occupying the same location. One generation builds, another modifies, another rebuilds, another abandons, another returns. Layer upon layer. The process repeats so frequently throughout history that it begins feeling less like an exception and more like a rule. Perhaps cities do not truly disappear. Perhaps they simply become foundations. That thought carries a strange mixture of comfort and discomfort. Comfort because nothing is entirely lost. Discomfort because nothing remains unchanged. Everything becomes material for what follows. A wall becomes rubble. Rubble becomes fill. Fill becomes ground. Ground becomes a foundation. The foundation supports another wall. History recycles itself with remarkable efficiency, not because people intend it, because practical needs encourage it. Ancient builders often worked with what already existed. Why remove every trace of the past when the past can support the future? The decision makes perfect sense, until thousands of years pass. Then it begins looking mysterious. A buried doorway appears. An underground staircase leads nowhere. A wall emerges beneath another wall. Modern observers encounter these discoveries and immediately begin imagining extraordinary explanations. And, to be fair, extraordinary explanations are often more entertaining. A hidden civilization, a forgotten empire, a lost world deliberately erased. The imagination enjoys grand narratives. Reality tends to be quieter, though sometimes no less fascinating, because the quieter explanation reveals something profound about human existence. Most buried worlds were not hidden, they were built over. There is a difference. Nobody needed a conspiracy. Nobody needed a secret. Time accomplished the task perfectly well on its own. Time, mud, weather, repairs, rebuilding, abandonment, and ordinary human activity. An astonishing amount can happen when those forces work together for centuries. Perhaps that is why ancient cities often resemble layered conversations. Each generation adds its own sentence, then leaves. The next generation responds, then leaves. Eventually, the conversation becomes so long that nobody remembers how it began. Yet traces remain, fragments survive. A floor here, a wall there, a forgotten object resting exactly where it was left. The city continues speaking long after its inhabitants have gone silent. There is something oddly moving about that, a reminder that human beings spend much of their lives constructing futures they will never personally witness. A builder lays stones. Those stones support a structure. That structure influences future decisions. Future people adapt around it. The builder disappears. The influence remains. History is filled with such invisible continuities. We tend to focus on dramatic events because dramatic events are easy to notice. Battles, coronations, disasters, revolutions. Yet much of civilization develops through slower processes. Maintenance, adaptation, accumulation, the patient work of ordinary people solving ordinary problems. Ancient cities rose because people kept repairing things, not because they planned to create archaeological layers, not because they intended to confuse future historians, simply because a roof leaked, a road flooded, a wall collapsed. Practical concerns shaped history more often than grand ambitions. That realization can feel almost disappointing at first, then strangely reassuring. Human history was built largely by people trying to get through the week. The same is true today. We imagine ourselves living in extraordinary times. Perhaps every generation does. Meanwhile, countless ordinary actions continue reshaping the future. A building is renovated. A road is widened. A foundation is poured. A neighborhood changes. The next layer quietly begins forming. One day, future people may uncover evidence of our own lives and experience the same mixture of fascination and confusion. They may wonder why we built certain structures, why we organized cities the way we did, why we valued some things and ignored others. The answers will probably seem obvious to us. They will seem mysterious to them, just as ancient decisions often appear mysterious now. Distance transforms practicality into intrigue. A drainage system becomes an archaeological puzzle. A storage room becomes a historical question. A forgotten foundation becomes evidence of something larger. And so the ground continues accumulating stories. Every generation contributes another chapter, another layer, another surface. The modern world often creates the illusion that everything is new. New buildings, new technology, new ideas. Yet beneath every present lies an astonishing amount of continuity. The new world rarely replaces the old one completely. It settles upon it, literally and figuratively. A city expands above older neighborhoods. A culture inherits forgotten habits. A society preserves solutions whose original problems disappeared centuries earlier. The past remains present, usually hidden, sometimes visible, always influential. Perhaps that is what makes buried cities so captivating. Not the mystery of disappearance, the mystery of persistence. The realization that old worlds never entirely leave. They linger beneath the surface, supporting what comes next, influencing what comes next, waiting beneath layers of certainty. And occasionally, when the earth is opened once more, reminding us that what appears permanent is often only the latest version of something much older. Because the ground beneath your feet is rarely just ground. It is memory, compressed, layered, patient. And if one could somehow peel back those layers one by one, descending through centuries as easily as descending a staircase. The journey would reveal something both beautiful and unsettling. Not one lost world, not one forgotten civilization, but countless worlds, each believing itself modern, each believing itself permanent, each standing upon the remains of those who came before, never quite realizing that one day they too would become part of the ground. There is a question that quietly follows every buried city. A simple question, a painfully human question. What was the last ordinary day like? Not the day historians remember, not the day disaster arrived, not the day everything changed. The day before, the final, completely normal day. The last morning when nobody suspected that their routines were about to become history. Perhaps it began exactly like hundreds of mornings before it. Someone woke before sunrise. Someone else complained about being tired. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A child resisted getting out of bed. A merchant thought about work. A farmer thought about weather. A baker thought about bread. Ordinary concerns. Small concerns. The kinds of concerns that seem insignificant until they suddenly become precious. Human beings spend most of their lives inside ordinary days. We remember the extraordinary ones, but we live inside the ordinary ones. That distinction matters. History often focuses on turning points. Life usually does not. Most people who eventually found themselves living through famous events had no idea they were doing so at the time. To them, it was simply another Tuesday, another harvest, another season, another year. The future still appeared available, and availability may be one of the least appreciated luxuries in human existence. The assumption that tomorrow exists, the assumption that plans matter, the assumption that next week can be imagined. Most of the time, these assumptions function so smoothly that we barely notice them. They become invisible, like air, like gravity, like the ground beneath our feet. Only when they disappear do we realize how much we depended upon them. Imagine walking through an ancient settlement during its final ordinary day. Children chase each other through narrow streets. Someone repairs a fence. Someone argues about money. Someone worries about a roof that still needs fixing. Someone postpones a task until tomorrow. Tomorrow feels guaranteed. Why wouldn't it? Tomorrow has always arrived before. There is a quiet confidence hidden inside everyday life. Not arrogance, not certainty, just habit. The habit of expecting continuity. And continuity is remarkably persuasive. It convinces people that current conditions will continue, that current problems will remain manageable, that current routines will survive. Most of the time they do, until they don't. The unsettling part is that the transition can be invisible at first. History encourages us to imagine disasters announcing themselves dramatically. Warning signs, thunder, chaos, a clear sense that something is wrong. Reality often behaves differently. Reality frequently arrives disguised as normality. A river rises slightly. A tremor passes through the ground. The air smells unusual. The weather behaves strangely. Animals appear restless. Tiny details. Easy to dismiss. Easy to explain away. Human beings are extremely talented at explaining things away. In fact, much of civilization depends upon that talent. If people reacted to every unusual event as though catastrophe were imminent, very little would get accomplished. Most strange things are harmless. Most concerns prove unnecessary. Most fears never materialize. Which means that ignoring danger is often rewarded, until the rare moment when it isn't. And that creates a difficult problem. How does one distinguish between an ordinary concern and the beginning of a disaster? The answer, unfortunately, is that people usually cannot. Not with certainty, not in real time, only afterward, only when hindsight transforms ambiguity into inevitability. The signs always appear obvious once the outcome is known. Beforehand, they look like ordinary details. Consider how many times people throughout history noticed something unusual and simply continued with their day. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps they were wrong. Either way, dinner still needed cooking. Children still needed attention. Work still needed completing. Life has a remarkable ability to continue even while danger approaches. Perhaps especially while danger approaches. There is something strangely moving about that. The persistence of ordinary responsibilities. The refusal of daily life to pause. Imagine an ancient parent preparing a meal while unknowingly living through the final peaceful evening their community will ever experience. Imagine a merchant carefully organizing inventory that nobody will purchase. Imagine a builder planning projects that will never begin. Not tragic in a dramatic sense, tragic in a familiar sense, because everyone understands unfinished plans. Everyone understands expectations interrupted. And perhaps that is why the remains of ancient cities affect us so deeply, not because they reveal death, because they reveal interrupted futures. A collapsed wall is interesting. A future that never arrived is heartbreaking. Archaeology occasionally offers glimpses of those interrupted futures. A room still prepared for use. Tools left in place. Storage jars partially filled. Repairs left incomplete. Evidence that people expected continuation. Evidence that tomorrow remained part of their thinking. The objects themselves are ordinary. Their context transforms them. A half-finished task becomes a message across centuries. Not intentionally, yet unmistakably, the message says something very simple. We thought there would be more time. Perhaps that is the most universal sentence in human history. More time, more harvests, more seasons, more opportunities, more chances to finish what remained unfinished. The expectation feels natural, reasonable, almost unavoidable. And then occasionally, history reminds people that time is not distributed equally. Some communities receive centuries, others receive days. Some receive warning, others receive surprise. The pattern is inconsistent. The outcome remains familiar. Change arrives. The ordinary day ends. A different world begins. When we look back at ancient disasters, there is often a temptation to focus exclusively on the event itself. The flood, the eruption, the collapse, the abandonment. Yet the final ordinary day may be more revealing, because it shows what people valued before fear entered the picture, what occupied their minds before survival became the priority, what mattered when life still felt predictable. A city reveals its character through routine. Disaster merely interrupts it, and routines leave traces, more traces than one might expect. A worn threshold, a repaired pathway, cooking areas, storage spaces, evidence of repetition, evidence of habits performed so frequently that nobody considered them remarkable. Human beings are creatures of repetition. We create patterns. Then we inhabit those patterns until they become invisible. The same route to work, the same seat at a table, the same morning ritual, the same assumptions about tomorrow. Ancient people behave no differently, which is why their remains feel unexpectedly familiar. Across thousands of years, the details change. The psychology does not. People continue planning, continue postponing, continue assuming there will be time. History repeatedly demonstrates how fragile those assumptions can be, yet humanity continues making them anyway. And perhaps that persistence deserves admiration. A species fully aware of uncertainty continues building futures, continues planting crops, continues constructing homes, continues imagining tomorrow, again and again. The alternative would be paralysis. Civilization requires optimism, even when optimism occasionally proves misplaced. The buried cities of the world preserve evidence of that optimism. Not grand optimism, ordinary optimism, the quiet expectation that life will continue. A storage room prepared for future use. A repaired roof expected to survive another season. A pathway maintained because people intend to walk it again. Tiny acts of confidence. Tiny acts of faith. Most went unnoticed until history interrupted them. Then suddenly those ordinary decisions became remarkable. A preserved room, a forgotten street, a buried house, a silent reminder that every ordinary day carries a hidden uncertainty. Not because disaster is always approaching, it usually isn't, but because nobody ever knows which ordinary day will eventually become the last one remembered as ordinary. The people living inside those buried cities did not know. They could not know, and perhaps that ignorance was a gift. Because if they had known, the day would not have felt ordinary at all. The children would have played differently. The conversations would have sounded different. The plans would have changed. The simple pleasures would have become precious. Instead, they experienced the day exactly as it arrived, casually, normally, without realizing that future generations would someday wonder about them, wonder what they ate, wonder what they feared, wonder what they hoped for, wonder what the sky looked like during the final peaceful evening before everything changed. And somewhere, in countless ancient cities now hidden beneath soil, mud, ash, stone, and centuries of forgetting, the traces of those final ordinary days still remain, waiting patiently, like footprints beneath the earth, like echoes trapped beneath silence, like unfinished sentences that history never had the chance to complete. The strange thing about mud is that nobody fears it at first. People fear fire. People fear storms. People fear earthquakes. People fear armies. Mud rarely inspires immediate terror. It appears too ordinary, too familiar, too unimpressive. A child can step in mud. An animal can walk through mud. A farmer works with mud almost every day. Mud belongs to ordinary life, and perhaps that is precisely why it becomes dangerous. Because ordinary things are often allowed closer than extraordinary ones. Imagine standing beside a river after several days of rain. Nothing dramatic has happened. Not yet. The water appears slightly higher. The current moves a little faster. The banks seem narrower. Tiny differences. The sort of differences many people would ignore. Life continues. Markets open. Meals are prepared. Repairs are completed. Conversations drift toward ordinary concerns. Nobody stops living simply because the river looks different. Most people have responsibilities. Responsibilities tend to win arguments against vague anxiety. The roof still leaks. The grain still requires storage. The children still need attention. The animals still need feeding. Life continues moving forward. And meanwhile, the river continues rising, slowly, patiently, without urgency. Nature often behaves this way. The most significant changes rarely announce themselves. They accumulate. 1 inch, then another, then another. Human beings are surprisingly poor at recognizing gradual danger, not because they are foolish, because gradual danger resembles normality. It arrives disguised as continuity, the same river, the same fields, the same roads, only slightly altered. And slight alterations are easy to overlook, until they aren't. Perhaps that is why so many ancient disasters began not with panic, but with uncertainty. People noticed something, then questioned themselves, then continued working. The human mind is constantly negotiating with discomfort. Is this serious? Am I overreacting? Has this happened before? Will it resolve itself? Most of the time, those questions lead to reasonable conclusions. Sometimes they lead people directly into catastrophe. The difficulty lies in telling the difference. Imagine an ancient settlement watching the river swell. A few families move belongings to higher ground, others decide to wait. Some worry, some laugh at the worriers. Every community contains both types of people. History suggests that neither group performs particularly well at predicting the future. The anxious are sometimes right, the relaxed are sometimes right. Reality rarely rewards certainty, and so the waiting continues. The sky remains grey. The river continues speaking in its low, endless voice. The ground grows softer beneath every footstep. Perhaps someone notices water where water does not normally appear. Perhaps a pathway has disappeared. Perhaps a field resembles a shallow lake. Still, life continues. One more day, one more evening, one more ordinary meal. Then eventually something changes. Not dramatically. Not at first. A little water crosses a boundary. A place that should be dry becomes wet. That is often how the process begins. A small violation, a subtle crossing, the river quietly entering territory that once belonged to people. There is something unsettling about boundaries dissolving. Humans depend upon boundaries. Roads, fields, walls, property lines, shorelines. The distinction between here and there, safe and unsafe, mine and not mine, floods ignore such distinctions completely. Water behaves as though boundaries are merely suggestions, and mud behaves the same way. Once water arrives, mud follows, always, patiently, inevitably. A strange partnership. Water opens the door, mud moves in, and, unlike water, mud rarely leaves gracefully. That may be why ancient people often feared the aftermath more than the flood itself. The water eventually retreats. The mud remains everywhere. Inside homes, inside storage rooms, inside workshops, inside wells, inside courtyards, inside doorways, inside shoes, inside daily life. Mud possesses a remarkable talent for becoming involved in everything. A thin layer across a floor changes how people walk. A thicker layer changes whether they can walk at all. A clogged doorway becomes a problem. A buried pathway becomes a problem. A contaminated water source becomes a problem. A damaged storage room becomes a problem. And problems accumulate quickly after a flood, far more quickly than solutions. The ancient world understood this intimately. The danger was rarely confined to the moment itself. The danger lingered. A ruined harvest might not become visible for months. Contaminated water might create illness long after the river receded. Damaged buildings might collapse weeks later. Mud transformed immediate disasters into prolonged ones. It stretched suffering across time, a peculiar cruelty. The flood arrives quickly. Recovery arrives slowly. Perhaps that is why mud appears so frequently within humanity's oldest memories, not always by name, but by consequence. The exhaustion, the rebuilding, the endless cleaning, the constant repairs, the sensation that ordinary life has become heavier because mud is heavy, not only physically, emotionally, psychologically. There is something deeply discouraging about cleaning the same mess repeatedly. Ancient people knew this. Every generation knew this. A flood arrives. People rebuild. Another flood arrives. People rebuild again. The cycle continues, year after year, century after century. Eventually, entire cultures begin organizing themselves around the expectation of future inconvenience. An interesting phrase, future inconvenience. Most civilizations imagine themselves preparing for greatness. Many ancient societies spent enormous energy preparing for mud, canals, levees, drainage systems, raised platforms, elevated storage rooms, protective embankments, ingenious solutions. all designed to answer the same persistent question. How do we continue living in a place determined to become wet? The answer was rarely elegant, but it often worked, at least temporarily. And temporary success is usually enough for civilization to continue. That may be one of history's least appreciated truths. Most systems do not survive because they are perfect. They survive because they function slightly longer than the problem requires. Then people inherit them. Then traditions emerge. Then future generations forget why the system existed in the first place. A raised foundation becomes normal architecture. An elevated road becomes ordinary infrastructure. A flood barrier becomes part of the landscape. The original emergency fades. The adaptation remains. In this way, mud quietly shaped entire civilizations. Not through dramatic destruction, through repetition, through persistence, through the endless requirement to respond. A single flood creates a problem. Repeated floods create culture. Repeated floods create architecture. Repeated floods create institutions. Repeated floods create myths. That transformation is easy to overlook because it happens slowly. Yet some of humanity's oldest habits were born precisely this way. An inconvenience becomes a solution. A solution becomes tradition. A tradition becomes identity. And eventually nobody remembers the inconvenience that started everything. Meanwhile, the earth keeps collecting evidence. A flood layer here, a sediment layer there, another layer added decades later. Then another, tiny chapters accumulating beneath cities, beneath roads, beneath homes, beneath temples. Every layer representing a moment when the world briefly became more difficult. And then, eventually, normal again, or at least a new version of normal, because perhaps that is what civilizations truly do. They do not defeat nature. They negotiate with it. They adapt. They compromise. They accept certain risks in exchange for certain rewards. The river provides food. The river provides trade. The river provides fertile soil. The river also occasionally reminds everyone who is actually in charge. And every reminder leaves traces. Mud beneath floors. Mud inside walls. Mud trapped between centuries. Mud quietly preserving evidence of lives that never expected preservation. Lives occupied by ordinary concerns, ordinary routines, ordinary hopes, until one day the river arrived. Then the mud arrived, and after enough centuries had passed, the mud remained long enough to become history itself. The longer a story survives, the less it resembles its beginning. That is not a flaw. It is simply the nature of memory. Memory is not a museum. It is a river. Things enter, things leave, details dissolve, shapes remain, and perhaps nowhere is this more visible than in humanity's oldest stories about destruction. A flood occurs. People survive. Years pass. The survivors tell their children. The children tell their children. Generations pass. The water gradually becomes larger. The danger becomes greater. The story becomes older. Eventually, the original event disappears behind the meaning it created. And the meaning is often far more durable than the facts. Imagine sitting beside a fire thousands of years ago. Night surrounds the settlement. The air is cool. The day's work has ended. The storyteller begins speaking, not about a flood. Not really. About memory. About fear. About survival. The flood is merely the vehicle. The deeper subject is uncertainty. Human beings have always struggled with uncertainty. We dislike it. We resist it. We invent systems to reduce it. Calendars, laws, governments, religions, architectures, traditions. Every civilization builds structures designed to create predictability. And every civilization eventually discovers the same uncomfortable truth. Predictability is never guaranteed. The world remains capable of surprise. A river changes course. A harvest fails. A disease appears. A city falls. A coastline moves. A volcano awakens. The earth reminds everyone that control is always partial, never complete. Perhaps ancient flood stories became so powerful because they transformed uncertainty into narrative. A frightening event becomes understandable once it acquires a beginning, middle, and end. The structure itself provides comfort. Reality rarely provides such structure. Reality is messy. Floodwaters do not arrive according to literary principles. Disasters do not pause for dramatic effect. The earth does not care about storytelling. Humans do. And so, humans create stories. Stories capable of holding experiences too large to hold any other way. The fascinating part is that these stories appear in remarkably different places, different cultures, different languages, different landscapes, yet familiar themes continue appearing. A great destruction, a warning, a few survivors, a beginning after an ending. For centuries, people have noticed these similarities. Some see evidence of a single forgotten catastrophe. Others see evidence of shared human psychology. Both interpretations reveal something interesting, because regardless of origin, the stories clearly touch something deep within the human imagination, something universal, something enduring. Perhaps it is the realization that every generation secretly wonders whether its world is permanent. Not consciously, not every day, but somewhere beneath ordinary concerns. The question lingers: will this continue? Will the things I depend upon remain? Will the world I know still exist tomorrow? Most of the time, such questions remain hidden. Life is busy. There are bills to pay, fields to cultivate, families to care for, meals to prepare. The future usually appears close enough to touch. Then, occasionally, history behaves unexpectedly. A familiar system collapses. A trusted institution fails. A city changes. A landscape changes. A certainty disappears. Suddenly, people discover that permanence was always an assumption, not a guarantee. Ancient flood myths captured that realization beautifully. The old world ends. A new world begins. The pattern feels symbolic because it is symbolic. Yet symbols often emerge from reality. A flood genuinely destroys familiar worlds. Not the entire planet, perhaps, but entire worlds from the perspective of those experiencing it. And perspective matters. A farmer watching fields vanish beneath water is not thinking globally. A parent searching for safety is not calculating geography. A merchant losing everything is not measuring continental impact. They are experiencing the end of their world, their routines, their expectations, their future. The emotional truth is enormous, even when the physical event remains local. Over time, local endings can become universal stories, not through deception, through memory. Memory naturally expands around meaningful experiences. It simplifies, it organizes, it emphasizes. The process is remarkably human. In fact, we continue doing it today. Think about family stories. Every family possesses them. Stories repeated at gatherings. Stories about difficult winters, hard journeys, unexpected survival. The details shift slightly with each retelling. Certain moments become larger. Certain moments disappear. Eventually, the story becomes something more than history. It becomes identity. Ancient civilizations behaved similarly. Their stories preserved not merely events, but lessons, warnings, values, fears, hopes. The flood itself mattered. The meaning mattered more. And perhaps the most enduring meaning involved renewal, because despite all the destruction, flood stories rarely end with emptiness. They end with continuation. That detail is important. The world survives. Life continues. Something remains. Ancient people were realistic enough to understand disaster. They were optimistic enough to imagine recovery. Civilization requires both qualities. Too much fear creates paralysis. Too much confidence creates vulnerability. The balance between them produces resilience. And resilience may be the true hero hidden inside these ancient stories. Not the flood, not the destruction, the rebuilding. Humans repeatedly rebuild, again and again, across centuries, across continents, across cultures. A city disappears, another emerges, a community collapses, another forms. The pattern repeats with astonishing consistency. The earth changes, human beings adapt. The earth changes again, human beings adapt again. There is something quietly impressive about that. Something easy to overlook. History often emphasizes collapse because collapse is dramatic. Adaptation is less dramatic. Adaptation happens one decision at a time, one repair, one adjustment, one compromise, one ordinary act of persistence. Yet those small acts ultimately determine what survives. Perhaps that is why so many ancient settlements reappeared after disasters. People returned, not because they forgot what happened, because they remembered what was valuable. The river remained dangerous. The river remained useful. Both things could be true simultaneously. Human beings have always possessed a remarkable ability to live with contradictions. The place that feeds us may also threaten us. The thing that sustains us may also harm us. The future may be uncertain and worth pursuing anyway. Ancient people understood this, perhaps better than we do. Their lives depended upon it. Every harvest required trust. Every season required hope. Every construction project required confidence in a future nobody could guarantee. And so the stories survived. The stories of endings, the stories of beginnings, the stories of worlds washed away, the stories of worlds rebuilt. Meanwhile, beneath the stories, beneath the myths, beneath the symbolism, the earth continued preserving evidence. Mud layers, flood deposits, buried foundations, forgotten streets, silent reminders that real people once experienced real disruptions. Not abstract lessons, actual interruptions, actual uncertainty, actual loss, and actual recovery. The longer one studies these layers, the more a curious possibility emerges. Perhaps humanity has always been telling the same story, not because one event happened everywhere, because the same pattern keeps happening. A world feels permanent. A disruption occurs. People adapt. A new normal emerges. Then, eventually, another disruption arrives. The cycle continues. Again and again. Generation after generation. Civilization after civilization. Not a single reset. Many resets. Large ones. Small ones. Personal ones. Collective ones. Some remembered. Most forgotten. Each leaving traces behind. Each becoming part of the ground. Part of the stories. Part of the human imagination. And perhaps that is the quiet truth hidden beneath all the myths of great floods and ancient endings. The world rarely ends once. It ends a little every day. A building disappears. A tradition fades. A language changes. A memory vanishes. A generation passes away. Small endings accumulate continuously, yet beginnings accumulate too. New buildings, new traditions, new ideas, new lives, new hopes. The earth keeps turning, the rivers keep flowing, the layers keep forming, and somewhere beneath our feet, countless earlier worlds remain buried in silence, reminding us that every ending eventually becomes somebody else's beginning. It is easy to imagine ourselves as observers of history. We read about ancient cities. We examine ruins. We look downward into excavations and feel separated from the people who once lived there. The distance appears enormous, thousands of years, entire civilizations, countless generations. The separation feels comfortable, safe. History belongs to them. The present belongs to us. At least that is how it seems. Yet every buried city contains a quiet reminder. The people living there probably felt exactly the same way. They too looked backward. They too inherited stories. They too believed they were standing in the newest chapter of the world. The future belonged to them. The ruins belonged to someone else. The distinction must have felt obvious, natural, permanent, and perhaps that is what makes the subject so strangely unsettling. Not because ancient people were different, because they were familiar. Familiar enough that the distance begins collapsing. Imagine, for a moment, an archaeologist living thousands of years from now, not tomorrow, not next century, far enough into the future that our world feels ancient. The cities we know have changed. Coastlines have shifted. Languages have evolved. Entire political systems have disappeared. The future archaeologist arrives at a site. Perhaps it was once a neighborhood. Perhaps a business district. Perhaps a quiet suburb. Nobody remembers exactly. The records are incomplete. Time has done what time always does. It has simplified. Now the excavation begins. Layer by layer, carefully, patiently, the same process, repeated countless times throughout history. And gradually, traces of our lives emerge. Fragments of roads, pieces of buildings, sections of foundations, objects whose purpose seems obvious to us and mysterious to them. The future scholar pauses, examines an artifact, develops a theory. Perhaps the theory is correct, perhaps it is not. History is full of educated guesses. Even today, many questions about the past remain unanswered. The future will almost certainly feel the same, because people leave behind evidence, not explanations. The explanations often disappear first. That may be one reason ancient cities feel so haunting. We see the evidence. We imagine the explanations. A dangerous combination. The imagination eagerly fills empty spaces, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes disastrously. Yet regardless of interpretation, one fact remains. The people who built those buried worlds did not know they were building ruins. Nobody ever does. A city never introduces itself as a future archaeological site. A home never announces that it will someday become evidence. A road never reveals that future generations will wonder who walked upon it. The transformation occurs later, quietly, gradually, without permission. That realization can feel strangely personal because it applies equally to the present, the buildings surrounding us, the objects we use, the routines we consider ordinary. All of them are future history. The process has already begun, not in some distant century. Now, at this very moment, a building is being abandoned somewhere. A road is being replaced somewhere. A neighborhood is changing somewhere. A habit is disappearing somewhere. The layers continue forming, exactly as they always have. The difference is merely perspective. We notice ancient layers because they are ancient. We rarely notice our own because we are standing inside them. Perhaps future generations will discover traces of our world beneath their feet and experience the same emotions we feel today. Curiosity, confusion, wonder, a strange sense of connection, and perhaps something else. A realization that ordinary life leaves extraordinary footprints. Not intentionally, simply through repetition. Human beings spend most of their lives performing small actions, opening doors, walking paths, repairing objects, preparing meals, making plans. The actions seem insignificant individually. Collectively, they shape entire civilizations. The ancient world demonstrates this repeatedly. Not every buried city disappeared because of catastrophe. Some faded gradually. Trade routes shifted. Resources changed. Populations moved. Economic priorities evolved. The city slowly emptied. Life relocated elsewhere. The buildings remained. The silence arrived. Then, eventually, the earth continued the work. Wind, rain, vegetation, time. Nature rarely rushes. Nature prefers patience. Patience is usually enough. There is something almost comforting about that. The earth is not malicious. The earth is not plotting. The earth is simply indifferent. And indifference often proves more powerful than hostility. Hostility requires effort. Indifference merely waits. Every wall eventually weakens. Every road eventually cracks. Every structure eventually faces the same opponent, time, the most patient force ever encountered by humanity. Perhaps that is why ancient ruins evoke such complicated emotions. They reveal both fragility and endurance simultaneously. A city falls, yet traces remain. A civilization disappears, yet memories survive. A building collapses, yet foundations endure. Loss and persistence existing side by side. The contradiction appears everywhere. History is filled with contradictions. The more one studies the past, the more difficult it becomes to separate endings from continuations. Did a civilization truly disappear if its ideas survived? Did a city truly vanish if another city grew from its remains? Did a culture truly end if future generations inherited its habits? The answers become surprisingly complicated. Perhaps because history resembles a river more than a series of separate ponds. Things merge. Things continue. Things transform. Nothing remains unchanged. Yet very little disappears completely. Even buried cities continue influencing the future. They shape archaeology. They shape stories. They shape identities. They shape how later generations understand themselves. The dead continue participating in the world through the traces they leave behind. A remarkable thought, and perhaps a comforting one, because when people imagine buried civilizations, they often imagine disappearance, absence, erasure. Yet the evidence suggests something subtler. Transformation. A city becomes a ruin. A ruin becomes a mound. A mound becomes a field. A field becomes an excavation. An excavation becomes knowledge. The form changes. The influence remains. And perhaps the same will eventually be true of us. Not individually, collectively. The future will inherit pieces of our world, some intentionally, others accidentally. They will misunderstand certain things, understand others, create stories, develop theories, argue about meanings, exactly as we do today. History is less a record than a conversation between generations that never meet. Each generation receives fragments. Each generation interprets them. Each generation adds new fragments before departing. The conversation continues. No final answer arrives. No definitive conclusion appears. Only more layers, more questions, more attempts at understanding. Perhaps that is why the image of buried cities remains so powerful. Not because they represent the end of history, because they reveal that history never truly ends. It simply changes speakers. The people beneath the ground once occupied the present. Now we do. One day, someone else will. The pattern is ancient. The pattern is ongoing. And beneath every modern street, beneath every familiar building, beneath every place that currently feels permanent, the future is already preparing its own archaeology. Quietly, patiently, one layer at a time, exactly the way it always has. Perhaps the strangest part of this entire journey is that we began with mud, not kings, not empires, not battles, not treasures. Mud, a substance so ordinary that most people spend very little time thinking about it. A substance usually encountered briefly and then forgotten. Something wiped from shoes. Something tracked into homes. Something washed away when possible. And yet, for thousands upon thousands of years, mud has quietly participated in the writing of human history. Not as a ruler, not as a hero, not even as a villain, simply as a witness. A patient witness. Perhaps the most patient witness of all. Long before written records existed, mud was there. Before monuments, before cities, before roads, before stories, the rivers carried it, the floods deposited it, the wind moved it, the earth gathered it, layer after layer, century after century. Long before anyone imagined archaeology, long before anyone imagined civilization, the process had already begun. And somehow it continues even now. The ground beneath our feet appears still. Yet it is never truly still. It is collecting, always collecting, fragments of weather, fragments of buildings, fragments of lives, fragments of memory. Everything eventually contributes something. A stone, a seed, a wall, a footprint, a broken tool, a forgotten object, a lost coin, a piece of pottery, a section of road. The earth accepts them all, patiently, without judgment, without preference, without hurry. There is something almost comforting about that. Human beings spend enormous energy deciding what matters. History itself often appears selective. Some people become famous, others disappear. Some events are recorded, others are forgotten. The earth behaves differently. The earth keeps everything it can, not because it cares, because it does not care. The distinction is important. Nature preserves without intention. And occasionally that lack of intention produces remarkable results. A footprint survives, a wall survives, a room survives, a city survives. Not completely, never completely, just enough. Enough to remind future generations that somebody lived there, somebody hoped there, somebody worried there, somebody expected tomorrow. Perhaps that is what buried cities reveal more clearly than anything else. Not the greatness of civilization, the normality of civilization, the fact that history is mostly composed of ordinary people attempting to create ordinary lives. We often imagine the past through its exceptions, its conquerors, its rulers, its catastrophes, its legends, yet the overwhelming majority of human experience has always occurred elsewhere. In kitchens, in workshops, in fields, along roads, inside homes, in conversations now lost forever. The buried world preserves traces of those quieter lives, and in doing so, it creates a peculiar sensation, a feeling that the distance between then and now is much smaller than we expected. The people beneath those layers were not waiting to become history. They were simply living the same way people are living tonight. Somewhere a family is eating dinner. Somewhere a child is falling asleep. Somewhere somebody is making plans for next year. Somewhere somebody is postponing a task until tomorrow. The pattern continues. The details change. The pattern remains. That realization may be one of the most humbling lessons history offers. Human beings often believe themselves unique, special, entirely different from those who came before. Then archaeology uncovers another buried city, another forgotten street, another preserved room, and suddenly the familiar appears again. The same concerns, the same adaptations, the same hopes, the same assumptions about the future. Thousands of years pass. Human nature remains surprisingly recognizable. Perhaps that is why these ancient layers feel less like ruins and more like conversations. Not complete conversations, fragments, sentences without endings, questions without answers, yet conversations nonetheless. The people who left those traces cannot speak directly. The earth speaks for them, A worn threshold says someone passed this way repeatedly. A repaired wall says someone cared enough to fix it. A buried floor says someone once considered it the center of their world. Tiny messages, quiet messages, messages written accidentally. And perhaps accidental messages are often the most honest. Monuments announce what people wanted remembered. Everyday objects reveal what people actually did. The difference can be fascinating. A king builds a monument to celebrate power. A buried kitchen reveals what people ate. One tells us about ambition. The other tells us about life. Both matter, yet one often feels closer, more human, more familiar. The deeper one descends into history, the more these ordinary traces begin to dominate the imagination. Not because they are dramatic, because they are relatable. The owner of a buried house probably worried about problems that felt enormous at the time. A damaged roof, a difficult season, a sick child, a financial burden, a disappointing harvest. Concerns that seemed urgent. Concerns that occupied entire days, perhaps entire years. Today, those worries are invisible. Only fragments remain, and that too carries a lesson. Many things that feel permanent are temporary. Many things that feel overwhelming eventually pass. The earth has watched countless worries arrive and disappear, countless ambitions, countless fears, countless certainties. The earth remains remarkably unimpressed by all of them. Not cruelly, simply consistently. Mountains erode, rivers shift, cities rise, cities fall. Generations come and go, the process continues. Yet within that enormous cycle, individual lives still matter. Not because they last forever, because they happen at all. The buried world is filled with evidence of lives that were brief and ordinary and deeply meaningful to the people living them. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps it always was. A city does not need to survive forever to matter. A life does not need to become famous to matter. A story does not need to be remembered by everyone to matter. The value exists in the living of it, not merely in the preserving of it. And still, some traces survive. A few footprints, a few walls, a few layers beneath the ground. Enough for future generations to wonder. Enough for curiosity to persist. Enough for history to continue asking questions. As our journey slowly comes to rest, imagine standing once more upon an ordinary piece of ground. Nothing remarkable. A field, perhaps. A quiet street. A patch of earth beside a river. The surface appears simple. Yet beneath it lie countless layers. Layers of weather. Layers of memory. Layers of forgotten decisions. Layers of human lives. World beneath world. Story beneath story. Century beneath century. A vast hidden archive stretching downward into time. Most of it unseen. Most of it unknown. Yet present all the same. And perhaps that is the final thought worth carrying into the quiet hours of the night. The ground beneath your feet is not merely ground. It is a book, a very old book, written slowly, written accidentally, written by rivers and storms and cities and generations, written by people who never expected their lives to become part of its pages. And even now, as new days become old days and old days become memory, another page is quietly being added. Another layer, another story, another world, waiting patiently beneath the next.